The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, carried on a silver tray by a housemaid who did not yet understand what she was delivering. Lady Eloise Ashworth was seated at the breakfast table in the small dining room of her townhouse on Half Moon Street, a house that had once belonged to her husband and now belonged to her son, though Thomas was only 4 years old and cared far more about the marmalade cat who slept beneath the kitchen stove than he did about property. The morning light came through the east-facing windows in long, pale columns that fell across the white tablecloth and turned the teapot to gold, and Eloise was reading a letter from her steward in Dorset about the drainage of the lower pasture when the second letter was placed beside her plate. She did not recognize the handwriting. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, sealed with deep red wax that bore no family crest, only a smooth, deliberate impression, as though the sender had pressed a coin into the wax rather than a signet ring. Eloise set down her steward's letter, turned the envelope over, and opened it with the small ivory knife she kept beside her correspondence tray. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down beside her plate, picked up her teacup, and took a slow sip of Darjeeling that had gone slightly cool. The letter was from Lady Arabella Sinclair. It began with a courtesy so thin it was nearly translucent. "I hope this finds you well, and that young Thomas is thriving." And then it moved, with the efficiency of a woman who had spent years learning exactly where to place a blade, into the substance of its purpose. Lady Arabella wished Eloise to understand something. She wished her to understand it clearly, so that there could be no confusion, no false hope, no quiet embarrassment of the kind that follows a woman who has misread her circumstances. The Duke of Hartfield, the letter said, had been hers for 3 years. He would remain hers. Whatever attentions he had shown to Eloise, the visits, the conversations, the afternoon he had spent reading to Thomas in the garden, these were the habits of a man who was kind and occasionally restless, not the intentions of a man who was choosing. He was not choosing. He would not choose. And Lady Arabella wrote this not from cruelty, she said, but from a desire to spare Eloise the particular humiliation of believing she had been courted when she had merely been pitied. The word pitied was underlined once. Eloise set the letter down. She looked at the morning light on the tablecloth. She listened to the sound of Thomas talking to his nursemaid in the room above, something about a drawing he had made of a horse, though it sounded from his description more like a table with a tail. She thought about the drainage in the lower pasture, and whether the steward's estimate of £40 was reasonable, or whether he was padding the cost as he sometimes did when he thought she was not paying close enough attention. Then she pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the writing case she kept on the sideboard, dipped her pen, and wrote a single word in the center of the page. Good. She folded the paper once, sealed it with plain wax, addressed it to Lady Arabella Sinclair at her house on Curzon Street, and rang for the housemaid. "Please have this delivered this morning," she said. "There is no rush. Whenever the boy is going out." The housemaid took the letter and left, and Eloise returned to the drainage estimate, made a note in the margin to query the £40, and finished her breakfast. She did not think about Lady Arabella's letter again for nearly an hour. And when she did think about it, standing at the window of the upstairs sitting room while Thomas played with carved wooden soldiers on the rug behind her, what she felt was not grief or anger or even surprise. What she felt was a settling, like sediment dropping to the bottom of a glass of water that had been stirred. She had suspected. She had not wanted to suspect, but she had. And now the suspicion had been confirmed, and confirmation, even painful confirmation, was easier to carry than doubt. She had met William Cavendish, the Duke of Hartfield, 8 months earlier, at a dinner given by the Countess of Lyndhurst in her house on Berkeley Square. Eloise had nearly not attended. She had been out of mourning for 14 months by then. Her husband, Captain George Ashworth, had died of a fever contracted in Portugal 3 weeks before he was meant to come home, but she still found large gatherings difficult, not because of grief, which had softened into something quieter and more habitual, but because of the particular way people looked at her. Young widows with small children occupied an awkward place in society. They were pitied, but also watched. They were sympathized with, but also assessed. Every man who spoke to her for longer than 5 minutes was assumed to be courting her, and every woman who saw her speaking to a man for longer than 5 minutes was assumed to be right. She had gone to the Countess's dinner because the Countess had been her mother's closest friend and had written 3 times asking, and because Thomas's nursemaid had said, with the careful diplomacy of a woman who had been managing a household for 20 years, that perhaps it would be good for Lady Ashworth to wear something other than gray. So she had worn a dress of dark green silk, not quite mourning, not quite celebration, but something in between that felt honest, and she had been seated by the kind of accident that only a very attentive hostess can arrange, beside the Duke of Hartfield. He was not what she had expected. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had heard of him. He was 32, unmarried, enormously wealthy, and sat in the House of Lords with a voting record that suggested he actually read the legislation before he voted on it, which made him unusual among his peers. He was also, according to every drawing room in London, kept company with Lady Arabella Sinclair, a widow of considerable beauty and considerable ambition, who had been seen on his arm at the opera and in his box at Ascot, and, it was whispered, in his carriage after midnight on more than one occasion. Eloise had expected him to be charming in the way that powerful men often were, attentive enough to be flattering, distracted enough to be honest about where his real attention lay. Instead, he had asked her about Dorset. She had mentioned in passing that she was overseeing her son's estate through a steward, and he had leaned forward and asked what she grew, and whether the chalk soil gave her trouble with drainage, which it did, which was exactly the problem her steward had been writing about that very week. And they had talked for 40 minutes about crop rotation in tenant cottages and the particular difficulty of managing an estate when every tradesman assumed that a woman's signature on a letter meant the letter could be ignored. He had not flirted with her. He had not complimented her dress or her eyes or the way the candlelight caught her hair. He had talked to her as though she were a person who knew things, which she was, and as though he were interested in the things she knew, which he appeared to be. She had gone home that night and thought about him for exactly 12 minutes before telling herself to stop. But he had called on her 3 days later, and then again the following week. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in November, he had arrived unannounced and found Thomas in the garden attempting to teach the marmalade cat to sit, and he had knelt on the damp grass in what were clearly very expensive trousers and helped Thomas with the cat for half an hour, and when the cat had walked away, as cats do, he had stayed and read Thomas a story from a book of fables that was missing its cover, doing all the voices, including a deeply committed rendition of a talking badger that made Thomas laugh so hard he got hiccups. Eloise had watched from the window of the morning room and felt something shift in her chest like a door that had been painted shut, being quietly, carefully opened. Over the months that followed, his visits had become a rhythm she allowed herself to rely on. He came twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He brought books, for her, not for show, books he had actually read and wanted to discuss. He asked about the estate. He listened when she talked about George, and he did not flinch or redirect or try to fill the silence with reassurance. He sat with it. He sat with her, and she had begun to wonder. She had begun to wonder whether the visits meant what they appeared to mean, or whether she was misreading a man's kindness as a man's intention because she was lonely and he was there. She had heard about Arabella. She had never asked. She had told herself that it was not her place to ask, that he owed her nothing, that they were friends and friendship was enough, and she should not ruin something real by wanting it to be something more. But she had wanted it to be something more. She had wanted it quietly, privately, in the way she did most things, without announcing it, without making demands, without allowing the wanting to become visible enough to embarrass either of them. And now Lady Arabella had written to tell her that the wanting was futile, and Eloise had written back good, and the morning light was still coming through the windows, and Thomas was still playing with his soldiers, and the world had not ended. It had merely clarified. She decided that she would not mention the letter to anyone. She decided that when the Duke next called, he was expected on Thursday, she would receive him as she always had, with tea and conversation and the easy warmth that had become natural between them, and she would not allow Lady Arabella's letter to make her cold or distant or strange. She would simply stop wondering. She would take the door that had been opening in her chest and paint it shut again, carefully, neatly, and without making a mess. This was her plan. It was a good plan. It lasted until approximately 11:30 the following morning. What Eloise did not know, could not have known, was what happened when her single-word reply arrived at Lady Arabella Sinclair's house on Curzon Street. Arabella had expected several possible responses. She had expected tears, conveyed through shaky handwriting and blotted ink. She had expected dignity, conveyed through a carefully worded paragraph about respecting boundaries and wishing everyone well. She had even expected silence, which she would have interpreted as defeat. What she had not expected was a single word on an otherwise blank sheet of paper, written in a hand so steady it might have been set in type. Good. She read it 4 times. She turned the paper over as though there might be more on the back. There was not. She held it up to the light as though there might be a hidden message pressed into the grain of the paper. There was not. There was only the word sitting in the center of the page like a stone dropped into still water, and the longer Arabella looked at it, the more she felt the ripples. Good. Not I understand. Not thank you for telling me. Not please. He cannot mean so little to me. Just good. As though Eloise had been told that the weather would be fine tomorrow, or that the butcher had received a fresh delivery of lamb. As though the Duke of Hartfield, his attention, his affection, his future, was a matter of so little consequence to Eloise that the appropriate response was a single syllable of mild approval. It was, Arabella realized with a sensation she was not accustomed to feeling, the most dismissive thing anyone had ever written to her. By the time the Duke arrived at Arabella's house that afternoon, he had been expected for tea, a standing arrangement on Wednesdays that had persisted more from habit than from any renewed enthusiasm. Arabella had moved from confusion to something closer to fury, though she would never have called it that. She called it clarity. She called it the recognition that Eloise Ashworth's composure was not humility but arrogance, and that the Duke needed to see it for himself. She showed him the letter over tea. She had rehearsed the presentation. She placed Eloise's reply on the table between them, beside the plate of lemon biscuits, and said with a laugh that she had practiced in the mirror until it sounded effortless, "I thought you might find this amusing. I wrote to Lady Ashworth, just a kind word, woman to woman, so she wouldn't embarrass herself. And this was her reply." William picked up the paper. He read the single word, and Arabella watched his face, expecting amusement, expecting perhaps a shake of the head at the oddness of it, expecting him to set it down and reach for a biscuit and move the conversation along. What she saw instead was something she had never seen on his face before. He went still. Not the stillness of a man thinking, but the stillness of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of every conversation he has had for the past 8 months. His jaw tightened. His hand, the one not holding the paper, closed slowly into a fist on the arm of the chair. "What exactly?" he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled. "Did you write to her?" Arabella had not anticipated this question in this tone. "I simply told her the truth, that you and I have an understanding, that she shouldn't read too much into your— What did you say?" "William, I was trying to help." "Show me the letter." She hesitated. He did not ask again. He simply looked at her, and in the silence that followed, Arabella understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had miscalculated not slightly but catastrophically. She produced her copy of the letter. She always kept copies. It was one of her habits, a careful woman's insurance against being misquoted. William read it. He read the word pitied, underlined once. He set the letter down on the table beside the lemon biscuits and the single word reply, and he looked at them both for a long moment, the accusation and the answer side by side. "She wrote good," he said. "She clearly doesn't care about you at all," Arabella said, "which is what I was trying to—" "She wrote good," he said again, "because she would rather lose me than fight for me in the way you expected her to fight. She wrote good because she believed what you told her, and she accepted it, and she did not think she had the right to object." He stood up. "She wrote good because she has more dignity than either of us has deserved." "William, sit down. You're being ridiculous. She's a widow with a child and a crumbling estate in Dorset. Her estate is not crumbling. She has improved the drainage on the lower pasture, increased the tenant yield by 1/3, and repaired every cottage roof on the eastern boundary, all through a steward who tried to overcharge her at every turn until she replaced him." He picked up his gloves from the side table. I know this because I listened when she talked about it, which is something I should have done more of with more people, far earlier than I did. Arabella stood. If you walk out of this room, then what? He turned back to her, not with anger, with something worse than anger, with a kind of exhausted recognition, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time and finding the view disappointing. What will happen, Arabella? You will write another letter? You will tell another woman that I am yours, as though I am a painting you have hung on your wall? She said nothing. I should have ended this a year ago, he said. I stayed because it was easier to stay than to leave, and because I told myself that comfort was close enough to contentment. It was not. And I will not allow you to punish a woman whose only fault was being too proud to beg for something she deserved to be offered freely. He left without finishing his tea. The lemon biscuits sat untouched on the plate, and the 2 letters remained on the table, the long one and the short one. And Arabella sat in the silence they left behind, and understood, with a precision that felt like the closing of a door, that she had delivered the single piece of evidence that made the Duke of Hartfield certain of what he wanted. It was 20 minutes past 11 when William's carriage pulled away from Curzon Street. It was 11:45 when it arrived on Half Moon Street. The distance was not great, 6 minutes by carriage on a clear day, but he had stopped once on the corner of Piccadilly and sat in the stationary carriage for nearly 15 minutes while the driver waited and the horses shifted and the noise of the street moved around him like water around a rock. He was not rehearsing what he would say. He was thinking about what Eloise had done. She had received a letter designed to wound her. She had read it at breakfast, at the table where she read her steward's reports and helped Thomas butter his toast. She had absorbed the blow, and she had responded not with tears or outrage or even silence, but with a single word that gave Arabella nothing. No ammunition, no satisfaction, no proof that the blade had landed. She had written good and gone on with her mourning, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 8 months watching her, that she had done so not because she did not care, but because she cared too much to let the caring make her small. Good. It was the bravest word he had ever read. When the carriage arrived at Half Moon Street, William stepped down, told the driver to wait, and knocked on the front door. The housemaid who opened it looked startled. He was not expected until Thursday, but she showed him into the morning room and went to fetch Lady Ashworth. Eloise appeared 4 minutes later. She was wearing a dress of pale gray, not morning gray, but a softer shade like morning fog, and her hair was pinned simply, and she had a smudge of ink on the side of her left hand that told him she had been working on correspondence. She looked at him with the calm, careful expression she always wore when she was uncertain, the expression that kept her composure intact while her mind moved quickly behind it. "Your Grace," she said, "you're 2 days early." "I am," he said. "Eloise, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without interrupting, because if you interrupt I will lose my nerve, and I have very little of it left." She sat down in the chair by the window. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. "Arabella showed me your reply," he said. "She showed me both letters, hers and yours. She showed me because she expected me to be amused, or to confirm what she had written, or to dismiss you as someone who did not matter enough to be worth the postage. Instead, I read what she wrote to you, and I read what you wrote back, and I understood in the space of 10 seconds what I have been failing to understand for 8 months. He was standing by the fireplace, one hand on the mantelpiece, not because he was posing, but because he needed something solid to hold on to. "You wrote good," he said. "You wrote good because you believed you had no claim on me. You believed that because I never gave you one. I came here twice a week and talked to you about drainage and Dorset and read your son stories about talking badgers, and I never once told you why I was coming. I let you wonder. I let you doubt. And when someone who had no right to speak for me wrote to tell you that you were nothing to me, you believed it because I had given you no evidence to the contrary." Eloise's hands were very still in her lap. Her face had not changed, but her breathing had shifted. He could see it in the rise of her shoulders, the way the gray silk moved. "I came here because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. "Not because you are beautiful, though you are. Not because you are clever, though you are that too. Because you are the only person in my life who has never once asked me for anything. You have never asked for my title or my money or my influence or even my attention. You have simply been yourself, steady and honest and real. And you have let me be myself in return, and I did not know how rare that was until this morning, when I realized that I was about to lose it, because I was too much of a coward to name it." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. It was not a new ring. It was his mother's, a sapphire set in gold, with 2 small diamonds on either side, worn smooth at the band where his mother had turned it on her finger during conversations for 31 years. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the letter, not because Arabella forced my hand, because I have known for months that you are the person I want beside me, and I have been afraid that if I said it aloud, you would see me clearly and decide that I was not enough." The room was very quiet. The morning light had moved across the floor since he arrived, and it now fell across Eloise's hands in her lap, catching the ink smudge on her left hand. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. And then she said, very quietly, "No." He blinked. "Not no forever," she said. "No today. Because you arrived here 11 minutes after reading my letter, which means you made this decision in a carriage between Curzon Street and Half Moon Street, and I will not be proposed to by a man who is still angry with someone else." He opened his mouth to protest. "You are angry with Arabella," she said, "and you are angry with yourself, and both of those feelings are justified, and neither of them is a reason to propose marriage. Come back when the anger is past, and if you still want to ask me then." He stood there for a moment, the ring in his hand, the light on the floor between them, and then he did something that surprised her. He laughed, not loudly, not dismissively, but with the quiet, exhausted recognition of a man who has just been told the truth by someone who respects him enough to tell it. "You are doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Being braver than me." He put the ring back in his pocket. He nodded once, and then he left, and the carriage wheels sounded on the cobblestones outside, and Eloise sat in the chair by the window and pressed her hands against her face and breathed. She did not cry. She wanted to. She wanted to cry because she had just refused the thing she wanted most in the world, and she had done it for the right reasons, and the right reasons did not make the wanting stop. But she did not cry, because Thomas came running in 3 minutes later with a drawing of what he said was a ship, but looked more like a shoe. And she told him it was the finest ship she had ever seen, and they sat together on the rug and drew an ocean around it, and by the time the nursemaid came to collect him for his afternoon rest, the ache in her chest had quieted to something she could carry. 3 days passed. Thursday came, the day he was normally expected, and he did not come. Eloise told herself this was what she had asked for. She told herself that she had told him to wait until the anger passed, and he was waiting, and this was the correct and honorable response. She told herself this for approximately 6 hours before she began to worry that she had miscalculated entirely, and he was never coming back. On Friday, a parcel arrived. It contained a book, a recently published treatise on modern drainage techniques for chalk soil, with a note tucked inside the cover in his handwriting. It said, "This made me think of the lower pasture. I am not angry anymore, but I am waiting, as instructed. W." On Saturday, a second parcel arrived, a small wooden horse, beautifully carved, with a note that said, "For Thomas. The Badger sends his regards." On Sunday, nothing arrived, and Eloise spent the day being irritable with the housemaid, apologizing to the housemaid, and then being irritable with herself for being irritable. On Monday, a letter arrived. Not a long letter, not a declaration or a plea or an argument. Just a letter in his handwriting that said, "I sat in the House of Lords today and voted on a grain tariff, and the entire time I was thinking about whether your steward has resolved the drainage estimate. I have thought about this for 6 days. I believe the anger has passed. In its place there is something much quieter and much more certain, and it has your name on it. If you would permit me to call on you tomorrow, I would be grateful. If you would prefer more time, I will wait. I have discovered that I am surprisingly good at waiting when the thing I am waiting for is worth it." Eloise read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote back, "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, bring the ring." He arrived at 3 minutes past 10 because his driver had taken a wrong turn on Piccadilly, or so he claimed, and Eloise was standing in the morning room in a dress of deep blue silk that she had chosen deliberately because blue was not gray and not green and not mourning and not caution. It was the color of a woman who had made a decision. He walked in. He looked at her. He reached into his pocket. "Before you ask," she said, "I want you to know that I am not saying yes because you came back. I'm saying yes because you left when I asked you to leave. Every man I have ever known has argued when told to wait. You waited. That is why." He held out the ring, his mother's sapphire gold band worn smooth. "I would like to argue," he said, "that I also came back, and that should count for something." "It counts for everything," she said. "Ask me." He asked her. She said yes. Thomas, who had been listening at the door because 4-year-olds are not known for their respect of closed doors, ran in and asked if the Duke would read him the Badger story, and William picked him up and said he would read him every story in the house, and Eloise stood by the window in the blue dress with the morning light on her hands and thought, "Good." And this time, the word meant something entirely different. They were married 6 weeks later, in the small chapel at Hartfield, with Thomas serving as ring-bearer and dropping the ring twice and retrieving it both times with the grave determination of a boy who understood that this was an important job. The wedding was quiet. 40 guests, no London spectacle, no one from the gossip columns invited. The Countess of Lyndhurst came and cried into her handkerchief and told anyone who would listen that she had arranged the seating at that dinner on Berkeley Square with exactly this outcome in mind, which may even have been true. Eloise wore ivory silk with a lace overlay that had belonged to her mother, and when William saw her walking toward him down the aisle, he did something that none of the 40 guests expected, and all of them remembered. He stepped forward, met her halfway, and offered his arm so that they walked the last 10 steps together. "You were not supposed to do that," the vicar said afterward. "I know," William said, "but she has walked far enough on her own." The first months at Hartfield were a negotiation, as all marriages are, but it was a negotiation conducted with more honesty than either of them had expected. Eloise had opinions about the estate, strong opinions formed by 3 years of managing her son's property in Dorset, and she expressed them clearly, though always through the steward, as was proper, and always with the quiet firmness that William had first noticed at the Countess's dinner table. The head gardener was startled. The head groom was skeptical. The steward, a man named Fletcher, who had served 3 dukes, listened to her suggestions about the tenant cottages, implemented them within a month, and privately told the housekeeper that the new Duchess was the first person in 20 years who had actually read the estate ledgers. William, for his part, discovered that marriage to Eloise was not the sacrifice of freedom he had been taught to expect. It was the opposite. It was the first time in his life he could sit at his own breakfast table and say, "I do not understand this tariff bill," and not worry that the admission would be used against him. It was the first time he could read a letter that frustrated him and hand it to someone who would tell him honestly whether his frustration was justified or whether he was being unreasonable. It was the first time he could be uncertain without being alone in the uncertainty. Thomas adapted to Hartfield with the easy resilience of a child who has been loved consistently and does not doubt that love will continue in a new setting. He claimed the East Garden as his territory, befriended the stablemaster's daughter, and informed the cook, within the first week, that he preferred his eggs scrambled and not boiled, a preference the cook honored with the gravity it deserved. He called William Sir for the first 3 months, Your Grace for one confusing week in June when he was trying to be formal. And then, one evening in late August, while William was reading him the Badger story for what was certainly the 50th time, Thomas said, "Papa, can the badger have a horse?" And William kept reading without pause, because pausing would have meant acknowledging the word, and acknowledging the word would have meant crying, and he refused to cry in front of a 4-year-old over a story about a talking badger. He cried later, in the library, with Eloise, who held his hand and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Lady Arabella Sinclair left London that autumn. Not dramatically. There was no scandal, no public disgrace, no door slammed or letter published. She simply stopped appearing. The invitations continued for a time, then thinned, then ceased. She took a house in Bath and then a house in Florence, and within 2 years her name had faded from the drawing rooms that had once considered her essential. It was not punishment exactly. It was the natural consequence of having built a life around a man who had walked away, and finding in his absence that the structure had no foundation. Eloise heard once from the Countess of Lyndhurst that Arabella had been seen at the opera in Florence with a merchant of considerable wealth and no title whatsoever, and that she appeared content, or at least calm, which in Arabella's case might have been the same thing. Eloise felt nothing about this news, except a distant, impersonal hope that it was true. She had never hated Arabella. She had simply refused to participate in the contest Arabella had tried to create, and in refusing, she had made the contest impossible. 2 years after the wedding, their daughter was born, Charlotte, named for William's mother. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and a temperament that suggested she would, in time, have opinions about everything and the composure to express them without raising her voice. Thomas, now 6, declared himself her protector and took the role seriously enough that the nursemaid had to explain, gently, that the baby did not require protection from moths, dust, and the sound of rain, however well-intentioned the protection might be. 4 years after the wedding, their second son arrived, George, named for Eloise's first husband, because Eloise had asked and William had agreed without hesitation, understanding that the name was not a comparison, but a continuation. The dead are not replaced by the living. They are carried forward, gently, in the names and habits and small daily choices of the people who loved them. The estate at Hartfield became, under Eloise's quiet oversight, one of the most efficiently managed properties in the south of England. The drainage was resolved, the tenant cottages were repaired and expanded, the yield increased by 1/4 within 3 years, and by 1/3 within 5. Fletcher, the steward, told anyone who asked that the Duke's wife had the finest head for an account book he had ever encountered, and he said it not as a compliment but as a fact which was better. William sat in the House of Lords and voted on tariff bills and land reform, and spoke once in a debate on the treatment of widows in property law, during which he cited specific examples of stewards overcharging and tradesmen ignoring correspondence signed by women, and at least 2 other lords looked uncomfortable in ways that suggested the examples hit close to their own estates. Thomas grew. Charlotte grew. George grew. The Marmalade Cat, relocated from Half Moon Street, lived to an improbable age and spent its final years sleeping in a patch of sunlight in the library, precisely where William liked to read. And sometimes, on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the light came through the east windows and fell across the breakfast table in long pale columns, Eloise would sit with her tea and her correspondence and remember the morning a letter had arrived on a silver tray, a letter designed to make her feel small, a letter that had asked her to beg or weep or fight. She remembered choosing instead to write a single word that gave nothing away and asked for nothing and expected nothing, and she remembered how that word, that small, steady, complete word, had changed everything. Good. It had meant, at first, I accept this. I will not break. It had meant, later, I trust my own worth more than I trust your cruelty. It had meant, in the end, that she was the kind of woman who did not need to shout to be heard, did not need to weep to be seen, and did not need to fight to win. She simply had to be herself, steady, honest, real, and wait for the world to notice. The world, in the form of a man with a ring in his pocket and a story about a talking badger, had noticed. And that, if you have been listening closely, is the whole of it. Not a story about a woman who was rescued, not a story about a man who changed, a story about 2 people who were already who they needed to be and who simply needed, both of them, the courage to say so. 1 word at a time. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here, like letters on silver trays, whenever they are ready.